Looking back, the signs were there from the beginning. They were small at first, easy to dismiss, easy to explain away. A late night here, a vague excuse there. Nothing that seemed out of place on its own. But when you line them all up, one after the other, the picture becomes impossible to ignore. The cracks in our marriage had been forming long before I ever noticed them. Maybe I should have seen it coming. Maybe I should have asked more questions, paid more attention. But you never think it'll happen to you, not until the truth is staring you in the face and there's nowhere left to hide. Her name is Jessica. We met 10 years ago, back when life was simpler. I was working my way up in my career, still figuring out who I wanted to be. She was ambitious, driven, the kind of woman who knew what she wanted and how to get it. I admired that about her. From the moment we met, there was this spark between us, something electric that made everything else seem less important. We got married after 3 years of dating. It wasn't always perfect, but we made it work. Or at least, I thought we did. Things started to change about a year ago. I had made a mistake, one that could have serious consequences if the wrong people found out. I'm not proud of what I did, but at the time, it felt like my only option. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could keep it hidden. But secrets have a way of coming to light, and mine was no exception. Before I knew it, the situation had spiraled out of control. I found myself facing the very real possibility of legal trouble, the kind that could destroy everything I'd worked so hard to build. That's when Jessica stepped in. She took charge the way she always did, determined to fix the mess I had made. At first, I was relieved. I thought she was just trying to help, to protect me from the consequences of my actions. But as time went on, something about her behavior began to shift. She became more secretive, more distant. Her phone, once left carelessly on the counter, was now always within reach, screen locked, notifications hidden. She started coming home later and later, offering vague excuses about work or errands that never quite added up. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling in my gut, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, she was under a lot of stress. We both were. But the more I tried to push the doubts aside, the harder they became to ignore. The way she avoided my gaze when I asked about her day. The way she brushed off my questions with a quick smile and a change of subject. The way she seemed to be holding something back, even when we were alone together. Then there were the phone calls late at night, always answered in hushed tones. I would wake up to the sound of her voice drifting from the other room, muffled but unmistakably tense. When I asked who she had been talking to, she would laugh it off, saying it was just work or a friend who needed advice. But the answers never quite made sense. And no matter how hard I tried to believe her, the doubt kept creeping in. The distance between us grew wider with each passing day. Conversations that had once flowed easily now felt strained, filled with unspoken words and unanswered questions. The intimacy we had once shared began to fade, replaced by a coldness that neither of us seemed to know how to break through. I told myself it was just the stress of everything we were dealing with, that once the legal issues were resolved, things would go back to the way they used to be. But deep down, I knew that something had changed. It all came to a head one night when I found her standing by the window, phone pressed to her ear as she whispered into the darkness. Her back was to me, her posture tense, shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. I stood there in the doorway, heart pounding in my chest as I listened to the muffled fragments of her conversation. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, intimate, laced with something that sent a chill down my spine. When she turned and saw me standing there, her eyes widened with a flash of something that looked like guilt before she quickly masked it with a smile. "Couldn't sleep," she said, slipping the phone into her pocket as if that explained everything. But the tightness in her voice and the way her gaze flicked away from mine told me all I needed to know. I didn't confront her that night. Maybe I should have. Maybe if I had asked the right questions, pushed for the answers I needed, things would have turned out differently. But fear held me back, the fear of hearing the truth I wasn't ready to face. So instead, I turned away, pretending that I hadn't seen the cracks spreading through the foundation of our marriage, but the doubt wouldn't go away. It settled into my chest like a weight, pressing down on me with every passing day. I started noticing more and more little things that didn't add up: the way she would disappear for hours without explanation, the faint scent of cologne that clung to her clothes when she came home late, the way she seemed to avoid my touch as if the distance between us had become too great to bridge. And then there was the name. It slipped out one night when she thought I wasn't listening, just a single word, spoken too softly to catch at first. But once I heard it, I couldn't forget it. David. The name echoed in my mind, refusing to be ignored. I didn't know who he was or what connection he had to my wife, but something about the way she said it made my blood run cold. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they formed was one I didn't want to see. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that the stress and fear of my legal situation were making me see shadows where there were none. But the doubt wouldn't go away. It whispered to me in the quiet moments, filling my mind with questions that had no answers. That I knew I couldn't ignore it forever. The truth was there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. And no matter how much it hurt, I knew that I had to find it. Because the one thing I couldn't live with was not knowing. The first cracks had appeared, and I could feel the foundation of my life beginning to shift beneath my feet. What I didn't know then was how deep those cracks would run, or how much it would cost me to find out the truth, but one way or another, I was going to find out. The days that followed were filled with a sense of unease I couldn't shake. Each morning, I woke with the same heavy weight in my chest, the kind of pressure that made it hard to breathe, as if the air itself carried the weight of everything I didn't want to admit. I went through the motions of daily life, pretending that everything was fine, but the doubt lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't escape. Every glance, every word, every moment of silence between us felt charged with unspoken tension, as if the air had grown too thick with all the things we weren't saying. Jessica's behavior only grew more erratic. Her phone, once a constant source of distraction, now seemed to control her every move. She clung to it like a lifeline, her fingers tightening around it whenever I came near. Notifications that used to light up her screen now remained hidden behind a locked display. When I asked who she was texting, her answers were always the same: work, friends, nothing important. But the way her eyes flicked away, the way her shoulders tensed just slightly, told me there was more she wasn't saying. The late nights became more frequent. At first, they were easy to dismiss: meetings that ran late, last-minute errands, dinners with friends. But the excuses started to wear thin, especially when she stopped offering them altogether. More and more often, she would leave without explanation, her departure marked only by the sound of the front door clicking shut. When she returned, her smile was always just a little too forced, her laughter a beat too loud, as if she was trying to cover up the silence that had grown between us. That I told myself not to jump to conclusions. After all, we were both under a lot of stress. My legal situation had put a strain on our marriage, and it was only natural that Jessica would need an outlet. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, the doubt wouldn't go away. It clung to me like a second skin, tightening with every unanswered question and every glance that lingered just a moment too long. The breaking point came one Thursday night. Jessica had left the house hours earlier, saying she had a meeting with a client. I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting back to the image of her walking out the door, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The hours dragged by, each minute stretching longer than the last. By the time the clock hit midnight, the knot in my stomach had twisted so tightly that I could barely sit still. That I tried calling her, but the phone rang until it went to voicemail. I sent a text: "Everything okay?" But the message remained unread. As the minutes ticked by, the doubt in my chest hardened into something colder, sharper. I had ignored the signs for too long, convincing myself that I was imagining things. But not this time. This time, I needed to know the truth. Grabbing my keys, I stepped outside into the cool night air. The streets were quiet, the distant hum of traffic the only sound as I drove through the city. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't sit in that house any longer, surrounded by the silence of all the things Jessica wouldn't say. I drove past the places she usually went, her office, the coffee shop she liked, the gym she sometimes visited. But each place was dark and empty, offering no answers to the questions that burned in my mind. It wasn't until I passed the courthouse that I saw her car. My pulse hammered in my chest as I pulled over, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. The building loomed in the darkness, its stone facade illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. Jessica's car was parked near the entrance, half hidden in the shadows as if she had hoped no one would notice. I sat there for a moment, my breath shallow as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no reason for her to be there, no meetings, no clients that I knew of. And yet, there she was. Before I could talk myself out of it, I stepped out of the car and approached the building. The air was cold against my skin, each breath visible in the dim light as I moved closer. My footsteps echoed against the pavement, the sound too loud in the stillness of the night. I didn't know what I expected to find. Some part of me still clung to the hope that there was a logical explanation, that the doubt twisting in my chest would prove to be nothing more than paranoia, but as I approached the entrance, the faint glow of lights inside caught my eye. The glass doors offered a glimpse into the lobby beyond, a space that should have been empty at this hour, but wasn't. I stepped closer, my pulse pounding in my ears as I peered through the glass. And that's when I saw them. Jessica stood near the far end of the lobby, her posture tense, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Facing her was a man I didn't recognize, tall, with sharp features and a presence that seemed to fill the space around him. His suit was crisp, his stance relaxed, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made my chest tighten. The distance between them was too small, the air between them charged with something unspoken that I couldn't hear their conversation, but I didn't need to. The way Jessica tilted her head, the way her gaze flicked away and then back again, the faint, nervous smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, it all told me what I didn't want to know. This wasn't a business meeting. This wasn't a coincidence. This was something else, something that explained every late night, every unanswered call, every glance that lingered too long. That my breath fogged against the glass as I stood there, frozen in place as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The legal trouble I had been facing, the pressure that had been building for months, it all led back to this moment. I had made a mistake, one that could have cost me everything. And somehow, Jessica had found a way to fix it. But the price she had paid, the price she had chosen to pay, was standing right in front of me. The man leaned closer, his words too quiet to hear but heavy with meaning. Jessica's shoulders stiffened, her gaze dropping to the floor as if she couldn't meet his eyes. But she didn't pull away. She didn't step back. And as I stood there, watching the unspoken tension between them, the truth hit me with the force of a blow: she had done this for me. Whatever arrangement she had made, whatever lines she had crossed, it had all been to protect me from the consequences of my actions. But the price of that protection was written in the space between them, in the distance that no longer existed, in the silence that said more than any words could. That I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding before me. The cold seeped into my skin, but I barely felt it. My pulse pounded in my ears, each beat echoing the truth I couldn't ignore. I had wanted answers, but now that I had them, I didn't know what to do with them. As I turned and walked back to my car, the world around me seemed distant, as if I were moving through a dream I couldn't wake from. The night air pressed heavy against my chest, each breath a reminder of the weight I now carried. I had found the truth I had been searching for, but it had come at a cost I hadn't been prepared to pay. And as I sat behind the wheel, staring at the faint reflection of my own eyes in the glass, one thought echoed through my mind with relentless clarity: nothing would ever be the same again. The drive home felt like moving through fog. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white against the leather, but I barely noticed. The city lights blurred past the windows, streaks of gold and red that faded into the background of my thoughts. Every breath felt heavy in my chest, each heartbeat echoing with the weight of what I had seen. The image of Jessica standing with that man, the judge, was burned into my mind, impossible to forget no matter how hard I tried. Their proximity, the tension in the air between them, the unspoken understanding that passed in their eyes, it all played over and over in my head, a loop I couldn't escape. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the air inside the car felt suffocating. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the darkened windows of our home. The house that had once been a place of warmth and comfort now felt like a prison, its walls heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. My breath fogged against the glass as I exhaled, my pulse hammering in my ears. I knew I couldn't avoid this conversation any longer. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Stepping inside, the silence hit me like a physical force. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant tick of the clock on the wall, every sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the house. My footsteps echoed against the hardwood floor as I moved through the hallway, each step heavier than the last. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Jessica was waiting in the living room when I found her. She stood near the fireplace, her back to me as she stared into the flickering flames. The soft glow cast shadows across the room, dancing across the walls and highlighting the tension in her shoulders. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, familiar, yet somehow foreign in that moment. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we both knew but hadn't yet said. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stood there, my breath shallow, my thoughts tangled in 1,000 different directions. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make her understand the betrayal that burned in my chest. But the words wouldn't come. When she finally turned to face me, her eyes met mine with a mixture of defiance and something else, something I couldn't quite name. There was no guilt in her gaze, no shame. Only a quiet determination that sent a chill down my spine. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had expected remorse, apologies, maybe even tears. But the woman standing before me was a stranger, someone I no longer recognized. The air between us crackled with tension as the silence stretched on, each heartbeat echoing in the stillness. My mind raced, searching for the right words, the right questions, but nothing seemed to fit. How do you ask someone why they betrayed you? How do you put into words the hollow ache that sits in your chest, the weight of knowing that the person you trusted most in the world has broken that trust beyond repair? And yet, as I stood there, the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface began to fade, replaced by something colder, sharper. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and with each click of understanding, the weight in my chest seemed to shift. Jessica hadn't done this out of spite. She hadn't betrayed me for her own gain. She had done it for me, to protect me from the consequences of my own actions. And somehow, that made it worse that I wanted to blame her. I wanted to hate her for what she had done. But how could I, when I was the one who had set this chain of events into motion? If I had never made that mistake, if I had never put myself in a position where the law could come crashing down on me, none of this would have happened. Jessica would never have met that man, never have stood in that courthouse lobby with secrets etched into her eyes. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, stealing the air from my lungs. I had been so focused on her betrayal that I hadn't stopped to consider my own role in this mess. My actions had started this fire, and Jessica had stepped into the flames to put it out. But in doing so, she had crossed a line that neither of us could come back from. The silence between us stretched on, each second heavier than the last. My pulse pounded in my ears as I tried to make sense of the tangled mess of emotions swirling inside me. Anger, guilt, sorrow, they all collided in my chest, making it hard to breathe. The weight of everything we had lost pressed down on me, suffocating in its intensity. Finally, Jessica broke the silence. Her voice was calm, steady, as if she had already accepted what I was only beginning to understand. Her words were simple, but they cut deeper than any accusation could have. She had done what she thought she had to do. She had made a choice, one that had cost us both more than we could have imagined. The room seemed to close in around me as her words echoed in my mind. I wanted to argue, to tell her that she should have come to me, that we could have found another way. But the truth was, I didn't know if that was true. Maybe there had been no other way. Maybe this was the only path that had led to me standing here, free and unpunished. But at what cost? I turned away, unable to look at her any longer. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I moved toward the window, staring out into the darkness beyond the glass. The faint reflection of my own face stared back at me, eyes hollow with the weight of what I now knew. The minutes stretched on, each one heavier than the last. I could hear Jessica's breathing behind me, slow and steady, as if she was waiting for something for me to speak, to react, to make some kind of decision. But I couldn't. Not yet. The weight of everything was too much, too raw, too impossible to untangle. Eventually, I turned back to face her. The firelight cast flickering shadows across her face, highlighting the tension in her jaw, the tightness around her eyes. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker there, regret, maybe, or sorrow. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only that same quiet determination that had sent a chill down my spine the moment I saw her. Without a word, I stepped past her, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood floor as I moved toward the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of everything that had happened was pressing down on my shoulders, threatening to drag me beneath the surface. By the time I reached the bedroom, my breath was shallow, my chest tight with the pressure of holding everything inside. As I closed the door behind me, the silence seemed to press against my skin, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the floor as my mind raced with questions that had no answers. How do you move forward when the foundation of your life has been shattered? How do you rebuild trust when the person you loved most in the world has betrayed you, even if it was for your own sake? I didn't know the answers. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. The silence in the bedroom was suffocating. I sat on the edge of the bed, elbows resting on my knees, head bowed as if the weight of my thoughts had become too heavy to hold upright. The air felt thick with the echoes of the confrontation that had just unfolded downstairs. Jessica's presence still lingered in the house, but I couldn't bring myself to face her again. Not yet. The air between us had shifted irrevocably, charged with the weight of secrets that neither of us could take back. My mind replayed the scene at the courthouse with relentless clarity. The way she had stood so close to him, the judge whose decisions had the power to alter the course of my life. The way her shoulders had tensed when he leaned toward her, his words too low to hear but heavy with implication. The way she hadn't stepped back, hadn't pulled away. Every detail etched itself into my memory, refusing to fade no matter how desperately I tried to push it aside. I had wanted to believe that there was some other explanation, that the doubts twisting in my chest were nothing more than the product of my own guilt and paranoia. But the truth had been undeniable, laid bare in the space between them. Jessica hadn't just crossed a line, she had obliterated it. And the worst part was knowing that she had done it for me. My mistake had set this chain of events in motion, and now we were both trapped in the consequences. The weight of that realization settled over me like a suffocating blanket. My breath came shallow and uneven as my mind raced through 1,000 questions with no answers. How long had this been going on? Had she approached him first, or had he sought her out once he learned of my situation? What promises had been made in the shadows of that courthouse? What unspoken agreements had sealed my fate in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend? I stood and began pacing the room, each step heavy with the pressure building inside my chest. The walls seemed to close in around me, suffocating in their stillness. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out the faint sounds of the city beyond the window. My thoughts spiraled faster and faster, each one sharper than the last. Had she hesitated before making that choice? Had she thought of me, of us, before stepping over the line that neither of us could now uncross? Guilt twisted like a knife in my chest. As much as I wanted to blame her, I couldn't ignore the role I had played in all of this. If I had never made that mistake, if I had never put myself in a position where the law could tear our lives apart, none of this would have happened. Jessica would never have found herself standing in that lobby, facing a man whose power extended far beyond the walls of that courthouse. She would never have been forced to make a choice that would cost us both more than we could have imagined, but knowing that didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the image of them together burned in my mind, a constant reminder of the line she had crossed. The woman I had trusted more than anyone else in the world, the woman who had stood beside me through every challenge we had faced, had become a stranger before my eyes. And no amount of justifications could erase the hollow ache that settled deep in my chest. Hours passed as I paced the room, my thoughts chasing themselves in endless circles. The clock on the wall marked the slow passage of time, each tick echoing in the silence like a reminder of everything that had changed. I tried to imagine what would come next, how we could possibly move forward after what had happened. But every scenario ended the same way, with the weight of her betrayal hanging between us like a barrier that neither of us could cross. Eventually, exhaustion began to seep into my bones, dulling the sharp edges of my thoughts. I sat back down on the edge of the bed, running my hands through my hair as I tried to steady my breathing. The ache in my chest hadn't lessened, but the initial shock had begun to give way to something colder, something that felt a lot like resignation. The life we had built together, the future we had once dreamed of, it all felt impossibly distant now, as if it belonged to someone else. That I didn't hear her approach until she stood in the doorway, her silhouette outlined against the dim light from the hallway. I didn't look up. I couldn't. The air between us felt like a chasm too wide to bridge, and I didn't know if I had the strength to try. She didn't speak, and the silence stretched between us, heavy with all the words we couldn't say. Minutes passed, but neither of us moved. Eventually, I heard her footsteps retreat down the hall, the faint sound of the guest room door closing behind her. The quiet settled back over the house, wrapping around me like a weight I couldn't shake. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling as my mind continued to race. Sleep felt impossible, but exhaustion eventually dragged me under, pulling me into restless dreams filled with fragmented images of what I had seen of Jessica standing too close to the man who now held the power to shape both our futures. When morning came, the world outside seemed unchanged, as if nothing had happened. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting pale stripes of light across the floor. But inside, everything was different. The weight in my chest hadn't lessened. If anything, it had grown heavier overnight, settling deep into my bones with the cold certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. That I knew I couldn't avoid the truth any longer. The confrontation had opened a wound that wouldn't heal on its own. The questions that haunted me demanded answers, and no matter how much I feared what those answers might be, I had to face them. The only question now was whether our marriage could survive the truth, or if this betrayal would be the thing that finally tore us apart for good. Morning light streamed through the blinds, casting pale streaks across the bedroom walls. The air was thick with the weight of everything unsaid, the silence between Jessica and me stretching like a chasm too wide to cross. I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the faint patterns of light on the floor as if they held the answers I couldn't find within myself. Sleep had offered no solace, only restless dreams filled with fragmented images that refused to fade. Jessica's silhouette in the courthouse lobby, the distant murmur of voices just beyond my reach, the unspoken tension that clung to the air between her and the judge. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't erase those moments from my mind. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly down the hall, a reminder that she was still here, that despite everything, we were still bound together by the life we had built, even if the foundation beneath us had begun to crumble. I stood, the wooden floor cool beneath my feet as I crossed to the window, staring out at the city beyond the glass. The world outside seemed unchanged, indifferent to the turmoil churning within me. People moved through their daily routines, unaware of the storm raging behind these walls. A part of me wanted to hold on to the life we had built, to pretend that this betrayal could somehow be undone. After all, Jessica hadn't acted out of malice. She had made her choice to protect me, to shield me from the consequences of my own mistakes. But knowing that didn't erase the hollow ache that settled deep in my chest. Love alone couldn't mend the cracks that had formed between us, and trust once broken was not so easily repaired. I left the bedroom and made my way downstairs, each step heavier than the last. The faint scent of coffee drifted from the kitchen, a reminder of the mornings we used to share before everything began to fall apart. Jessica stood by the counter, her back to me as she stared out the window, a steaming mug cradled in her hands. The faint lines of tension in her shoulders betrayed the weight she carried, though she tried to hide it beneath a veneer of calm. I paused at the threshold, the air between us thick with unspoken words. The memories of our life together played through my mind, the laughter, the shared dreams, the moments when it felt like nothing could break us. But those memories clashed with the reality that now stood between us, a barrier of choices and consequences that neither of us could undo. Jessica turned, her gaze meeting mine with a mixture of defiance and something softer, something that might have been regret, though she would never say the words aloud. For a moment, the air seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting to see which path we would choose. But the words that hovered on the edge of my thoughts refused to come, trapped beneath the weight of everything we had lost. I moved past her, the faint clink of my mug against the countertop the only sound in the stillness. The warmth of the coffee offered little comfort as I stood there, staring at the dark liquid as if it held the answers I sought. The silence stretched between us, heavy with all the questions I couldn't bring myself to ask. How long had it gone on? How many nights had she stood in that lobby, bargaining with the man who now held the power to shape our future? And most of all, could I ever look at her again without seeing the shadows of those choices etched into her eyes? Time seemed to slow as I stood there, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the city filtering through the silence. My thoughts circled endlessly, each question leading to another, until the weight of it all became too much to bear. I set the mug down with a hollow clink and turned to face her, the words rising unbidden from the depths of my chest. That I told her that I couldn't keep living with the weight of what had happened, that no matter how much I wanted to forgive her, the image of her standing with that man would always be there, a barrier I couldn't break through. The air seemed to press tighter against my skin as the words left my mouth, each one a blade that cut through the fragile thread that still connected us. Jessica's eyes flashed with something between anger and sorrow, but she didn't speak. Maybe she knew there was nothing left to say. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. I turned away, unable to meet her gaze any longer, and moved toward the staircase. Each step felt like a goodbye, the echoes of my footsteps trailing behind me like the final notes of a song that had reached its inevitable end. The bedroom felt colder when I entered, the familiar space now tainted with the weight of everything that had unfolded within these walls. I packed my things in silence, each item a fragment of the life I was leaving behind. The framed photos on the dresser, the books we had chosen together, the souvenirs from trips that now felt like memories belonging to someone else. Each item I placed in the suitcase felt like closing a chapter one had never expected to end. By the time I finished, the afternoon sun had shifted across the floor, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the past. I stood by the window for a moment, staring out at the city that had witnessed the rise and fall of everything we had built. The ache in my chest was still there, but beneath it lay a sense of finality, a certainty that this chapter of my life had reached its end. When I stepped back into the hallway, Jessica stood at the bottom of the stairs, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if holding herself together. Our eyes met for a final time, and in that moment, I saw the echoes of the woman I had fallen in love with, the woman who had once been my everything. But those echoes were drowned out by the choices we had made, the lines we had crossed, and the trust that could never be rebuilt. Without a word, I stepped past her, the sound of the suitcase wheels rolling across the floor the only sound in the heavy stillness. The front door loomed ahead, a threshold that marked the end of everything we had known. I hesitated for only a moment before opening it, the cool air of the outside world brushing against my skin like the first breath of a new beginning. As I stepped onto the porch, the weight in my chest began to ease, if only slightly. The world beyond the door stretched out before me, uncertain, unfamiliar, but filled with the possibility of something new. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that this chapter of my life had come to an end. And as I walked down the steps, suitcase in hand, I took the first step toward a future no longer defined by the mistakes of the past, because sometimes, the hardest choices are the ones that set you free. The air outside felt different as I stepped onto the street, a little colder, a little sharper, as if the world had shifted just slightly out of place. The suitcase in my hand felt heavier than it should have, weighed down not by its contents but by everything it represented. Each step I took away from the house echoed in my chest, a hollow rhythm marking the distance between the life I had known and the uncertainty that lay ahead. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The door closing behind me had felt too final, the sound of it lingering in my ears like the last note of a song that had played for too long. I knew that if I turned around, if I caught even a glimpse of the house where so many memories had been made, I might falter. And I couldn't afford to falter now. The city seemed to move past me in a blur, people hurrying along sidewalks, cars weaving through traffic, lights blinking against the gray sky. I moved through it all like a ghost, invisible and untethered, my thoughts too heavy to leave room for anything else. I kept walking until the streets grew quieter, until the noise of the city faded into the distance and only the sound of my footsteps remained. When I finally stopped, I found myself in a small park on the edge of the city, the same park where Jessica and I had once spent countless evenings talking about the future we wanted to build together. The bench near the fountain was empty, the water reflecting the pale light of the overcast sky. I sat down slowly, the chill of the metal seeping through my coat as I set the suitcase beside me. For a long time, I just sat there, listening to the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. My thoughts drifted through the past, tracing the path that had led me here, the choices I had made, the mistakes that had set everything in motion, and the betrayal that had shattered the life we had built. I thought of Jessica's eyes in that final moment when our gazes had met at the bottom of the stairs, and the faint flicker of something that might have been sorrow, or maybe it was just the reflection of my own. But beneath the ache that still lingered in my chest, there was something else, something quieter, steadier. A sense of finality. The road we had walked together had come to its end, not with a sudden break but with the slow unraveling of trust that could never be mended. And though the weight of that ending still pressed against my chest, I knew that this was the only path forward. That I sat there until the sky began to darken, the first hints of twilight softening the edges of the world around me. The ache in my chest hadn't vanished, it might never fully disappear, but it no longer felt like a weight I couldn't carry. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer defined the future that stretched before me. Rising from the bench, I picked up the suitcase and took one last look at the fountain, the faint ripple of water reflecting the fading light. Then, without hesitation, I turned and walked away, my footsteps steady against the pavement as I stepped into the unknown, because sometimes, the hardest goodbyes are the ones that lead to new beginnings.